Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Cave. I'm a digital producer with Harkin's Election SOS project. And before I turn it over to our panelists, I'm going to share my screen briefly just to show everyone some of the resources that Election SOS has available up until Election Day and even beyond Election Day, depending on the results. So I'll share my screen here briefly. So Election SOS, so we have, not only do we have, resources on everything from misinformation, we have voters guides, we have, key election dates you need to look at. So this is all on our electionsos.com website. So there's an expert network. We have a pitch this section. So that's our story database of pitches that journalists could, if they're looking for a day turn or something, they could find that there. And like I mentioned, we have other workshops coming up this week, also a voter guide and a scenario planning guide for newsrooms to kind of prepare for what might happen next week as we head into Tuesday and beyond. So that's briefly on my end. So I'm going to turn it over to the Carter Center, and we'll get this webinar started.
All right, good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Kari, Cobham. I'm the Senior Associate Director of the Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism and Media at the Carter Center. We are really grateful to be able to partner with Harkin this year on election SOS training. As you know, it's been a long decade this year in particular, and covering the election and the issues that impact you and your community does take its toll. So by the end of today's panel, we hope that you'll be able to have a really good understanding of what trauma is, to understand how trauma impacts you, and that you leave with some concrete ways, some concrete takeaways for taking care of yourself and strategies for moving forward for you and your teams if you're a manager. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce today's panelists that we're really excited to have with us. First, we have Dr. Lori Zoellner. She's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington, and she's the director of the University of Washington Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress. Both her research and her clinical experience focus on the prevention and treatment of PTSD, and she has a particular expertise in the area of memory processing. Dr. Zoellner is well recognized in traumatic stress studies, and she served on the board of directors of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies. Dr. Zoellner has written and published extensively on psychological reactions after trauma, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and on treatment. And then I wanted to introduce Heath Druzin. Heath is Boise State Public Radio's Guns in America reporter. He's part of a national collaboration between 10 public radio stations that examine all aspects of firearms in America. He's a former mental health journalism fellow with the Carter Center in 2015 and 2016. He previously covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and veterans issues for the Stars and Stripes newspaper. This is his second stint in Idaho. He covered crime, wildfires, and government for the Idaho Statesman from 2005 to 2008. So I want to welcome Dr. Zoellner and Heath for your time today. They're both going to offer some important perspective, both from a clinician's point of view and from a journalist who has experienced trauma. And so we'll have a Q&A at the end, but please feel free to drop questions in the chat as they come up. It'll help us direct the conversation as well. This is going to be a very open discussion, so we hope that you will continue to be engaged as well. So with that, I will turn to Dr. Zoellner. Can you tell us a little bit about, well, first tell us a little bit about your background, and then how trauma is such a broad topic, and I think that journalists are impacted by it in small and big ways, whether we're covering fatal car accidents or mass shootings and conflict like Heath has. So can you talk to us a little bit about what is trauma and how does trauma impact journalists, especially around now during the election, where things have just been really busy and difficult for a long time.
Great. Yes, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm happy to get into a little bit about what is trauma exposure and to talk a little bit about what to look out for, and also to shift over and talk about things that you can do as well, particularly in these times when there's incredible stress for many of us. You know, and I apologize, I was saying earlier, somehow I woke up this morning and don't have my normal voice. So journalists, you experience a range of potentially traumatic events. And a lot of times what we just think about really are experiencing traumatic events. So what we would talk about in terms of threat to somebody's physical and personal integrity. So war, sexual assault, earthquake. But there's also personally witnessing events. So seeing the events happen to other people or being in the proximity as they're happening. And then moving the range to repeatedly being confronted with details of the events. So this is the aftermath sometimes of events, the details of the events, stories of survivors, and hearing those things repeatedly. And the latter in particular really has been what's been called the domain of vicarious trauma, this being confronted with details repeatedly. What's interesting though is that in DSM-5, which is kind of like our Bible of mental disorders, there's actually a shift in describing what we call potentially traumatic events to include this repeated confrontation with details, images, things particularly related to somebody's job. And so we actually see in DSM-5 a recognition that jobs like journalists or first responders can also experience traumatic events or potentially traumatic events in the same way. Whereas before, that vicarious trauma kind of sat on the edges of what we defined as trauma. And one of the things that you should know is most people in their lifetime are going to experience trauma by the definitions that we use. And most people are going to be resilient. And what we mean by that is not that they don't react to the event, but just that over time, their reactions dissipate and they start feeling more like their normal selves again. But what's tricky is really trying to differentiate what's a normal reaction to what's more persistent pathological reactions, because the normal reactions shift over time into the pathological reactions. And really the difference isn't in the presence of the reactions, the difference is actually in the persistence of the reactions. And so just because you're having a bunch of things that I'm gonna next say, doesn't remotely mean that you have some problem. It might actually be a really normal reaction. But if these things shift and last for weeks or months, and then they start actually impacting your functioning, that's really where you start thinking that you need to take more active strategies to help yourself. And some of the things that I would really look out for, I would look out for intrusive memories. So this is re-experiencing of the event, having reminders come up and it take you right back to the event again, having nightmares of the event, have things in your own environment cue you and remind you about what happened in terms of a traumatic event. And just like I said a few seconds ago, it's real common after somebody's gone through something horrible to have intrusive memories. And so just because you have them and they're scary and they're upsetting to you, doesn't mean that they're pathological or they're problematic. It's actually just your system trying to process and work itself through. But if they persist, that's the problem. You also want to look out for more what we call hyperarousal symptoms. And sometimes people just think of these classically as being startled or on edge, but there's much more subtle ones that you want to pay attention to, like problems sleeping, problems concentrating or focusing, being irritable, more irritable than what's actually normal for you. And these are actually good markers to kind of tell yourself something's going awry here. I'm much more irritable. This wouldn't have set me off before, but now it's making me crazy, and I'm stewing about it and thinking about it. So paying attention to whether or not you're having problems sleeping, problems concentrating, being more irritable than usual. You also really want to pay attention to your thoughts. And thoughts can shift over to being much more dark. And it's real common that we talk about kind of your lens or your glasses that you view the world kind of shift and change after a trauma. And these are views about yourself, views about other people, views about the world in general. You know, you can beat yourself up. You can think about how horrible the world is. You can think about how scary and how evil certain people are in the world. And those are real common thoughts after going through a trauma or hearing just what kind of suffering people have had to deal with. And then I would pay attention to behaviors that you're noticing for yourself. If you're trying to avoid reminders about what happened, or not being interested in doing the things that you used to like. And then ones that are even more problematic are increasing your drinking, increasing your cannabis use, playing violent video games. All of those things people often kind of sink into to try to deal or inappropriately deal with what's actually happened. And, you know, I think the big problem with all of us is that we think that we can power through things, and we ignore, we suppress, and it's logical to think that you could just power through after something like this and things will go away. But sometimes it doesn't work. And that's really where, when you're seeing that persistence of, you try to ignore it, you try not to pay attention to it, you try to bury yourself in your work, you focus on the deadlines that you've got to do, and all of these things that I just mentioned are still there. And you just know it in the back of your head, and you've probably started shifting over to doing some of the things that you shouldn't be doing as well. We're not really great at predicting who's going to be resilient over time, because there's probably a bunch of small little predictors that make us all more resilient. But we are a little bit better at predicting who's going to have chronic psychopathology like PTSD, depression, substance use, those kind of things. And one of the things that is a consistent predictor is the severity of the trauma that you've been through. So the more horrible, the more horrific it is, it makes it more likely that you're going to have these symptoms persist. Relevant for us right now is ongoing stress. The more ongoing stress somebody has, that actually after a trauma is a very strong predictor of who's going to develop problems. And then finally, sorry, go ahead.
Since you raised that, I wanted to ask specifically about it. So I know sometimes we identify trauma as a specific event, and then once we're past that event, then we start to figure out what kind of impact it had and all of that. But there hasn't been, when it comes to the elections, there hasn't been November 3rd, I guess you can say, is this specific event in terms of the actual election. But the lead up to it, there's been so much going on. And I think journalists have been under threat. Communities have been under threat, underrepresented groups have been under threat. And so if you're a journalist and you're trying to report on all of this stuff coming in, and you're part of one of the groups that are directly impacted by this, there's ongoing trauma for you. There has been ongoing trauma for you, I think, for the last 5 years. And so this election is sort of like just part of a long road that has been consistent trauma over the past few years. How do you deal with that as a journalist, knowing that there's probably no end in sight for this right now? How do I manage my way through it? And then we'll go to Heath, because I'd like to hear from Heath how he managed out of conflict zones.
Great, yeah. The first answer is that it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? That you are developing patterns of behavior that are going to be helpful and adaptive, that allow for and also allow for support of those around you. And so what I was going to say was that one of the biggest predictors of somebody who's struggling is a lack of social support. And so one of the things that I would put on the list right away is figuring out how not to be a lone wolf. Figuring out where you go to get your support, how you get your support. We know from the empirical literature that it's important. And it's one of those things that really can get you through times like right now with the election. And so you're thinking about how you reach out and who you disclose to, who you take risks to really not just say, I'm not doing well, but actually to talk about what you're not doing well with and people that you trust. And if you don't have those people, you want to cultivate those people and find those people who you can talk and disclose with. Other things that you should be doing. One is, this is the time to actually be careful in terms of bad coping habits. This is not the time to be drinking excessively. This is not the time to be using cannabis all the time. It's also not the time to be playing violent video games all the time to relieve your stress. And instead, what you should really be doing is figuring out more adaptive, helpful coping strategies. And some of those we really talk about in terms of behavioral activation, of picking out things in your life and being purposeful about doing things that are either positive or make you feel like you've accomplished something, and trying to build that into your schedule every day. And there's lists of activities that people should do and whole kind of ranges of things. And I'll definitely give the link for that, or Anthony will put up the link for it as well. And then you need to, whatever events has happened, you need to process it. And journalists are really great at getting the information about the events, but sometimes they're not really great at processing the events. And what I mean by that is going through and talking about or writing about your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions that you had, what it means to you that you went through X, Y, and Z. And that's something you can do in writing by yourself. It's something you can do with a therapist. It's also something that you can do with your friends, of just disclosing and talking about things. And the other final thing is, I really would pay attention to your negative thoughts that are coming up. And you want to be mindful and observe when you're having negative thoughts of like, oh, I just can't handle it if so-and-so is elected. I've got to move. I'm not going to be able to make it. You can observe that you're having that thought, and then you need to challenge it and really try not to let yourself go completely dark, because it's pretty easy to go down into a deep spiral very, very quickly. And how you think matters about how you feel and what you do. So no judgment about the thoughts that are having in your head. Observe them, and then try to challenge them and try to figure out how to have a more, as best you can, balanced perspective that sees things. And then the final thing I would really quickly say is that there is great help out there in terms of therapy. And if you're struggling for 6 weeks, 3 months, don't wait. There are empirically supported treatments. There's a science to psychotherapy. We just don't make up what we do in therapy. There's a science, and some of the things that we're posting are actually principles that come up from the empirical literature that have been shown to handle anxiety and depression and distress. And so seek help sooner than later. If you're 4 to 6 weeks and still suffering, it's time to seek help. If it's 3 months, it's time to seek help. There's no reason not to seek help. And Anthony will also put up a link for the Cochrane review, which is just, it's from the NICE guidelines out of the UK. And they are just a wonderful resource if you ever want to figure out what the current empirical evidence is for any kind of condition. And I'm giving you the link for PTSD, so you can see what's actually recommended and who you should look for in terms of a therapist. So Kari, the answer is you're in a marathon, and build in things that help you pay attention to your mind, that help you pay attention to the health of your body, and then reach out to others and figure out some way that you can be connected in a meaningful way that you have. And with the election, we all have to cope ahead. right? Of like, what are we going to do on X, Y, and Z day to make ourselves feel supported no matter what happens?
Yeah, and I just want to add here, and obviously it's not the same thing, but as it relates to trauma, like in 2017, I remember my son was born early and he was in the NICU for an extended period of time. And then he came home and he was on a heart monitor, and we didn't know how long that was going to be. And it's sort of like you're living through the trauma without knowing if there's an end in sight. And I remember my therapist saying, "What's one thing that makes you feel better every day?" And I said, "I love taking a hot shower." And she said, "Okay, well, just take a hot shower for 5 minutes longer." And that was it. And it became that about how do I cope through each day instead of looking at it of like, I'm waiting for a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, no, there is no light at the end of the tunnel at this moment. We just need to like make it through the tunnel. And what can we do to make that journey a little bit easier, even though it's going to be hard? And getting yourself in that mindset, I found helped quite a bit. So let me turn to you, Heath, because you have, you were talking to us when we were planning this about some of your experience. I'd like to hear from you as a journalist who has covered conflicts, which is, you know, very different from elections in many sense. But in terms of the intensity of the emotions that I think everybody's feeling right now, some of them are parallel. Can you tell us a little bit about what your experience has been and how you've been able to cope through trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying would have been great to have Lori's advice back when I was covering war. Yes, but yeah, as you said, I am a recovering war correspondent. I was in Iraq and Afghanistan for a little over 5 years. So yeah, I kind of had both the sort of steady building of witnessing traumatic events as well as one particular event in my life. Obviously, if you're working in those areas, you end up seeing a fair amount of violence. You see you see a lot of bodies. You see the aftermath of bombings. It's a fairly steady drumbeat of things to process. So I think all of that was building anyway as I was covering those wars. But in 2012, I had a particularly traumatic event, which kind of pointed me towards working on these issues as a journalist. But yes, I was out on patrol with some U.S. and Afghan soldiers, and one of the people on the patrol actually tripped a bomb, and it was very close to me. It ended up taking 4 soldiers' lives, and it was, I mean, it was a whole mix of trauma. There was obviously the trauma of seeing it happen, seeing the aftermath. And then just that, Lori kind of mentioned this, I think, before, that there was also that deep fear, the sort of helplessness, which is, that's something that I hadn't really experienced before, and that really affected me, at least as much as everything else. So that event, that kind of goes into what to do and what not to do kind of scenario. As far as my newspaper, they actually did a great job taking care of me. So a real positive example of how a newsroom can properly take care of somebody who's just experienced trauma. Basically, after the bombing, I ended up at a U.S. base hospital, and I was physically pretty much okay. I had a concussion. I was getting checked out for a concussion, and they basically said, "Yes, you have a concussion. Don't do stupid things. Take care of yourself for the next few days." But as soon as my newsroom heard about that, I mean, I called them, and I think journalists can relate to this. I had the, I guess, understandable but not totally healthy response of, well, I still have things I need to get done. I still have reporting I want to do. So I was actually arguing with them, trying to stay in Afghanistan, and they did not give me a choice. They said, well, no, you're coming out. And they actually took a fairly extraordinary step. They sent a friend of mine, a colleague at the paper, they actually sent him in to come and be with me, to come out, to fly home with me. Now I know that's maybe not something everybody can do, but it really was, it was a really, nice gesture and really helpful, because I was in, as you can imagine, a very bad state at the time. So they did everything right, and they got me connected with mental health services. I didn't necessarily do everything right for myself. Yeah, I was definitely resistant to help, thought I could power through. I was kind of nodding along with Lori. She was checking a lot of the boxes that I did wrong. It turns out no matter how good the bourbon is, it's not actually going to help you with your trauma. So yeah, it took me a while to grapple with what was happening. But I was lucky. Lori mentioned support networks. That was one thing. I had very strong support networks, and I had I had colleagues who had been through that kind of thing and were healthy about it, and that did help me get through. That was really big.
So Heath, let me ask this, looking back now in retrospect, what do you, knowing what you know now and having experienced what you did and then gone through the process of processing it, as Dr. Zoellner brought up, and coping, what would you do differently?
I would, I would seek a professional to talk to earlier and stick with it better than I did. I think, yeah, I mean, that was a big mistake I made early on. And I think it took a lot longer to grapple with it than it would have. I'm lucky in that I had a very dark few months, but I didn't have that really devastating, persistent. I didn't have the devastating, persistent PTSD. There were some things that kind of stuck with me a bit, but yeah. But I did, I mean, I would say for a good 6 months, I was in a really bad way. And yeah, just acknowledging that I was and seeking out the professional help I needed was the biggest thing that I did not do. And I think, even in, and it's weird to think it's 8 years ago, even in the 8 years since, what's really encouraging is that I think that stigma is really falling away. It's still there, but I think people feel a lot more permission to ask for help because of panels like this. And I think that's a great change. There's more that needs to be done, but yeah, and I think it's really important that newsrooms get on board with that and that editors understand that. Maybe even more important than reporters, and that editors give their reporters that permission to ask for help and to take time. And maybe that can be a real tough part too.
So I want to come back to that, Heath, because I think you raise a really good point in the role that managers can play. I want to raise a question that just dropped into the chat from Christine Herman. She said, they struggle with feeling like, she's just a health reporter, not a war correspondent. So I shouldn't be struggling as much as I am with my work. How would you advise someone who feels like it's silly that I'm struggling so much, or feels like I really should be more resilient? What's wrong with me? And I'll address that to both Heath and Dr. Zoellner. I'd love to hear you if you can weigh in on that.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I started with my most dramatic example, but as I was telling all these guys before we actually got on this call, I did a lot of other work, more sort of traditional reporting before that. And one of my first jobs was as a cops reporter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I covered a lot of violent crime. I worked a lot in neighborhoods that were struggling with the legacy of segregation and poverty, and here I was, like a privileged white guy, and I was hearing all these stories, and I started feeling really awful. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, but I mean, it's sort of the definition of vicarious trauma. And I had a bit of a breakdown, like it really affected me. And, and then I felt guilty for feeling like that because the folks I was covering were the ones with the real problems. And so, yeah, no, I think, trauma comes in all kinds of packages. It doesn't have to be some big violent event. And I think you just need to give yourself permission to have those feelings, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think just dealing with them honestly is a real healthy first step.
Thank you, Heath. Dr. Zoellner.
Yeah, Heath, I would agree entirely. Where you get yourself into trouble is comparing yourself to other people. And because the reality is you're always going to find somebody else that is doing worse than you or has had something worse happen to you. And then you're always going to find somebody who is doing better. And that comparison is just one of those things that kind of sends you into that kind of spiral of negative thought. And there's lots of ways of which we all get kind of too much. It can, if you think about it as like a bucket of too much, you can have the whole bucket dumped on you, or you can have it drip on you, drip, 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 drip. And at some point in time, it does get to be too much. And that's where it really is what we were talking about before of assessing yourself and then figuring out ways to accept it and not beat yourself up over it, because comparing yourself is one of those negative cognitions that is not going to be helpful. And I'm not saying not to have it. You accept those cognitions, you observe them, and you recognize that you're having them, and then you step back and you figure out how to think about it a little bit differently. And then finally, you're figuring out how to adapt, and what changes do you need to make in your life to help you not have it be too much.
Thank you, Dr. Zoellner. Heath, I'm going to go back to you because you touched on how your newspaper did such a good job of making sure that you were okay and that your mental health was taken care of. Can you share a little bit about what they did to make sure that you were okay? And then while you're talking, I would like, if folks who are with us here on the panel, if you can also share in the chat how your employer supports mental health, or how you wish that your employer supported mental health, especially during this election. I think that would be great. But Heath, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing was, what I mentioned. They got me out of there, didn't give me a choice right away. They said, nope, you need to come back and we need to take care of you. When I got back, I was greeted with a lot of love, a lot of empathy from the newsroom. And I think one of the most important things they said to me, because I was already going through my head, like, okay, when can I get back to this and this, all these loose ends? And they were like, you are off the beat right now. And we need you to take as much time as you need. Now, obviously that you can't always get that, but take as much time as you need. I thought it was really, really important, because it took a little pressure off. Like I felt pressure, just my own pressure to get back. But they were pretty insistent that they weren't going to send me back until, until I was better. So, and then the very practical step was they also linked me up with mental health services in the area. And that seems obvious, but I don't know that it is always so obvious to people. And I don't know that people always, I don't know that everyone always knows where to go. So knowing that ahead of time, I think, is really important for managers, like having sort of a Rolodex and being like, okay, here's some suggestions, of places to seek help. Because I think when you're in that state, it can seem like an insurmountable obstacle just to find help.
So Heath, you mentioned that you worked in Baton Rouge as well. Obviously, that's not overseas in a conflict zone, but you were drawing parallels with us between some of the experiences you had there. Can you share that? Because I mean, we were just talking about how we have this tendency to compare, and it's not the trauma Olympics. We're not trying to measure like how horrible it was versus the other, but I'd like to hear about how those two experiences ran parallel with you working overseas in a conflict zone and then coming back to the US and reporting domestically, and it's still having an impact.
Yeah, so I worked in Baton Rouge before going overseas, but yes, the main thing was I was talking to a lot of family members of people who had been murdered. That was there was a lot of there was a high homicide rate in Baton Rouge, and I ended up talking to quite a large percentage of the family members of the victims. And that's something a lot of reporters do, even if you're not a full-time cops reporter. I mean, especially with newsroom cuts, I mean, like a lot of reporters cover a little bit of everything. So yeah, I was talking to families in pain, and I think the question we got was from a health reporter, and I'm sure you're talking to a lot of families in pain and people in pain, dealing with health issues, and I'm sure dealing with, our awful healthcare system, which causes its own traumas for people. And if you're empathetic, it makes you a better reporter. And I think it also makes you more susceptible to internalizing other people's grief. And I felt that. And, you've got to recognize that that's okay. That's normal. And really, that empathy is probably what makes you good at your job, but it also means you have to watch out for yourself a little more carefully, because other people's grief can kind of become your grief.
Yeah, that's so true. That is so true. Dr. Zoellner, you talked to, I wanted you to weigh in here, and then I wanted to talk a little bit more about resilience, because you mentioned earlier about resilience is a skill that you build. So would love to hear from you about how do you go about building that resilience while not ignoring your mental health. But I know you wanted to weigh in here first, so let's do that, and then we'll jump over to that topic.
In the work that our teams do, we spend most of our day listening to people's traumas and in detail and the most horrific kind of pieces that are there. And so very similar in some ways to some of the work that you all do as well. And one of the phrases that has been helpful for us is to think about the old children's toy, which was called a Weeble. And the catchphrase was, "Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down." And so it's this little creature that you touch, and it goes to one side, bounces back on the other side, and then kind of comes back to the center. And I think that's often really helpful when you're thinking about who you are. And Heath talked about empathy, and we don't want to be non-empathetic. I mean, that's some of the power in what we all do. And so the point is that there's going to be times that are going to knock you to one side or the other, and it's going to take you a while to come back to your equilibrium, and that's okay, and that's perfectly fine. And then when you do get knocked down, it's exactly what he said, as far as trying to figure out how to take the steps forward to keep yourself moving and get the help and the support that you need to do. And so, yeah, and some of that is, Kari, like what you were talking about, is cultivating resilience. And like I said before, it's not like there's some people that are, built more resilient than others. In fact, like I said, we're pretty awful at predicting who is going to be resilient, because it looks like it's probably a whole bunch of small little things. And what's nice about a whole bunch of small little things is that you can use those small little things to help yourself become more resilient. And so we often think about it much more like a muscle that you use, and you learn more about yourself, and you learn more about what you need to flexibly adapt in particular situations. And yeah, the principles behind it are really some of those same things that I was talking about before. It's making sure that you're choosing to be active when you don't feel like it. It's or coming up with small little pleasures or things that make you feel accomplished. It's paying attention to your thought processes. It's when you have big things happening, figuring out who in your life you can share with. And so there's a bunch of range of skills that I think are nice, because you can kind of figure out what works for you. And if you're having trouble figuring it out, talk to other people about it. And if you're continuing to have problems, find a good therapist. And therapists aren't like picking out your hairdresser. So you really shouldn't just go with your friend's best recommendation. Figure out what you're really struggling with. Is it depression? Is it anxiety? Is it substance use? Is it PTSD? And then look at the literature, find out what the treatments are that are actually effective. And I loved what he said earlier as well, just that stick with it. Most of the treatments that make some difference teach skills, and they teach it in about 6 to 12 weeks. It's not like you're signing up for therapy for years in your life. So, find somebody who's good, who's doing something that's got some evidence behind it, and then do it and do your homework. None of us like doing homework, but most therapy that's good therapy actually is more important how you apply it in your life than it is what you say in the room.
Thank you, Dr. Zoellner. All right, so we're going to move into Q&A. If anyone has any questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and we will recognize you and you can ask your question. If nobody has any questions just yet, I'm going to throw a free one out to Dr. Zoellner and to Heath. What is a question that journalists should be asking right now in advance of next week and then in the weeks to come, regardless of how things go?
Heath, I'm going to let you start on that one.
So just to clarify, do you mean what questions should they be asking of
about
themselves?
mental health, about their own mental health? Yeah.
Well, I think journalists, obviously this run up to the election's been different than just about anyone I think most of us can remember. And obviously around the election, we've got, we've got anti-racism protests, we've got clashes between right-wing counter-protesters and Black Lives Matter protesters. So I think when in the run-up to the election, I think it's good to just take a step back and just ask yourself, like, how am I doing right now? It's hard to take a break at the moment because we're getting so close, but how am I doing? Do I need a day maybe to recharge? I would say also one thing I forgot to say is, remember, if you need to take a mental health day, that is actually totally legitimate. Your mental health is your health. And if you need a day, you should take a day and don't feel bad about it.
Those are really great points. I would add that you probably know what your schedule is going to be like, kinda, for the next block of time, and what assignments you're going to be covering, or those type of things. And so there is a piece that you really should think about coping ahead. Regardless of what happens, we're all going to have reactions, and we're going to have intense emotions. I would guess, at different points in time coming up, and so thinking a little bit about how do you build in that, like Kari said, that extra time for yourself consistently, even if it's a few minutes a day. All of us have a few minutes, even if you're so busy and you're so stressed. All of us take a few seconds to breathe. It might even just be sitting on the toilet, and what you do while you're sitting on the toilet. You know, we all have a few minutes that we can do things to help get ourselves more centered, and support us. And then coping ahead also means thinking about, you know, what you're going to do and how you're going to get support, in the next block of time, and how that's going to be built into your schedule. And so just recognizing that, like everybody said, it's a really stressful time, and there's going to be some unique challenges ahead.
Yeah. A friend of mine who works in TV, she was saying, you know, have your election plan in terms of, have you had heat training? How is your organization taking care of you? Do you have PPE? What are you going to eat next week? Who's going to provide you with food? Just the little things so that you don't have to think about them. Those are all really important too, to keep you functional. So, all right, do we have any other questions? Or do I have to keep planting questions? All right, let me see. Heath and Dr. Zoellner, let me start with you, Heath. If there are 3 key takeaways that you want folks to walk away with today as we head into next week and then the months to come, what would that be?
Don't feel bad about feeling bad, no matter what is causing it. You know, again, just to reiterate, trauma does not have to be a bomb going off, not even close. And it can just be, it can add up over time, right? It can be a lot of little things that you experience. So give yourself permission to have those feelings. That would be number one. Number two, I would say, give yourself time. If you need time, I think you really should step away. You know, I had an editor who saw that I'd covered a series of tragedies all in a row, and she said, you know what, no more death and destruction for a few weeks. Just like, you're going to cover other stuff, that kind of thing. And that's, you know, sometimes you just need a breather, and it doesn't even necessarily mean you need to leave work. You might just need to focus on something else for a while. And then I would say, you know, another mistake I made was I didn't really have a mental health infrastructure set up. So think about those resources before you need them, if possible. Because it's kind of hard to start from scratch when you're hurting. And your workplace isn't always going to be the best resource, unfortunately. So yeah, I guess plan ahead.
All right, thank you, Heath. Dr. Zoellner, I'll go to you, and then there's a question in the chat that I'd like to address, and then we can wrap from there.
I really liked, Heath, I liked all your points. They're great. I might talk about one of them as kind of like being kind to yourself and allowing yourself to be that weeble that's moving around, and that's okay, and that's fine. And then I really liked Kari's point just about basics of, make sure that you're doing some of the basics, that you are eating regularly, which can be really hard sometimes, that you have food in the house, that you are trying to get sleep, you're exercising, and you're connecting with other people. So really thinking about some of those basics. And then I would say finally, support is powerful, and you can build support both for yourself and also by helping others. That your community, or whoever you define your community to be, and Heath is absolutely right. You kind of have to plan it ahead of time, and you have to be intentional about it. I think a lot of us just kind of think, oh, my community will come to me, or but you actually need to be smart about it and seek out people and be vulnerable to people. And that actually gives you a little bit of a buffer when things get tough. And that buffer can be great, both in terms of practical things like food showing up at your door when you don't have any time to do it. But it also could just be that person that you're cool to call in the middle of the night and go, literally. And so thinking about some of those basics is really important.
So that brings us to, that's a good segue to the question Susan Hunsinger was asking, can having a work safe person support individual to vent be valuable? And I want to say, before I turn to you all, yes, I think it can definitely be valuable, because if they're part of your organization or your team, then they probably understand better than anyone else a lot of the internal challenges that you're dealing with. I think the challenge of having one person to go to is that then they become, they have their own stuff. And so on a day that they may not be able to give you the support that you need, that's when it's crucial to have a group of people, like you have 3-4 people that you can reach out to. So if one doesn't have the emotional capacity that day, or they're sick, that you have other people that you can lean on. So I think having that safe person at work, super important, but it's always good to have multiple folks so that one person doesn't always feel like, every time I have an interaction with you, it's going to be a vent, so, and that can be tough. But what do you think, Dr. Zoellner and Heath? And then we'll wrap.
That's how our teams work. And it's not one person, and it does need to be reciprocal in that, and that's part of having good social support is hearing what other people are struggling with as well, and how they're dealing with it, and where they're failing and where they're not doing as well. So it's not even having a lone friend, though a lone friend is probably better than no friend at work. But for me, there's things that I can't share with the people in my life, but I can share it with my clinical team. And so that's actually a very necessary support for me and the work that I do.
Yeah, I mean, it was invaluable for me, especially when I was in a really dark place. I might not have done everything right as far as seeking professional help, but I was very lucky in that I had a good support system of coworkers who I could talk to, and who we had always talked about these things even before like a big event. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's, if you have that, the more colleagues like that you can talk to, the better.
I am muted. There we go. All right. I wanted to thank Dr. Zoellner for joining us today. I think this is a really important conversation. We're grateful to have you here. I want to thank you, Heath, for joining us. It's been great to have you back as a Carter Fellow and sharing some of what you learned. So thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for joining us the week before the election, which is a very, very busy time and a difficult time for all of you. So I hope this was helpful. Anthony will share some details with you about where you can find a recording of the session if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. But thank you all for joining. We hope this session was helpful, and we appreciate you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks all. Yeah, so this will be on our resources page that I showed you at the beginning. So I'll post that shortly. So.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Everyone have a safe election, and please take care of yourselves.